The agenda this week learned about a post-World War II effort to bring Holocaust survivors to Canada, heard from German writer and illustrator Nora Krug on facing her family's wartime past, and got a briefing on Ontario's rising problem with white nationalism. The agenda's Week in Review begins talking to two former premiers about why it's seemingly impossible for female first ministers to get re-elected. Let's take a look at a map which will reflect just the past decade in Canada and show how things have changed. If you go back to 2009, there was just one part of Canada that had a female premier. And then as you see the years go on, there was a point, I think, at which maybe 80% of Canadians lived in provinces and territories where the head of government was female. And of course, that brings us closer to today. We can see the shading disappearing. And in 2019, there are exactly, out of 10 provinces, 3 territories, and 1 federal government, zero first ministers. I want to get, if I can, Kathleen Wynne, let's get you started on this. I want to get very mathematical about this because Alison Redford referred to this in her first answer. Both of you lost, presumably because your parties have been in power for too long in some cases, you made bad decisions in some cases, the other guy ran a better campaign in some cases. What percentage of your defeat would you attribute to the fact that you are female?
Oh, my goodness. So let me just go back to the beginning of your question, because there are all sorts of reasons. And as we hear in the podcast, women come in at perilous times for the party, which I would say I did.
Yes, you did.
But there are women who follow popular male premiers, and the party's doing well, and still weren't able to deliver that re-election. So another point I want to make is that during my time as premier, I never would have had this conversation. I never would have talked about gender because, and I can hear Alison saying, yeah, because if we had mentioned this as an issue, there would have been a hue and cry about playing the gender card,
They'd say you were whining.
Exactly. So I think it's important that we look at it. I would say it's a small percentage, Steve. I don't know, but I also don't know whether that influence of gender is growing. I think there's a new permission because of what's happening in the United States, because of sort of right-wing populism, new permission for misogyny. That's what I'm worried about. And I think it's even more important today than maybe it was 10 years ago to have this discussion about what is it that goes on and name the degree to which gender might play a role.
Premier Redford, can you take or hazard a guess as to what percentage of your defeat would have been because of your gender, as opposed to your party had been in power for almost 4 decades, maybe the campaign didn't go very well, maybe there were controversies you couldn't overcome, et cetera?
Yeah. I think that, it's hard to put a number on it, but I would say Kathleen is right that there are all of those other factors. At the end of the day, I think Kate will probably frame this better than I can, but one of the things we found in our conversations is that very often the experiences that we have as women, when men have those same experiences, they're not judged as harshly for them. And so for me, that's more the qualitative factor around what happens to women who are in politics. It's almost as if the bar is so much higher because we are expected to be better at a number of things. And therefore, when something doesn't go well, for whatever reason that might be, the fall is quick. Whereas with men, it's sort of as if, we didn't really expect much. We didn't really expect that. And therefore, we won't get into anecdotal stuff, but in the last 2 years, there's been all kinds of stuff around this. And it's like, okay, well, we'll shrug our shoulders and the men will carry on. But boy, she told us she was going to be different, and she wasn't.
So that expectation issue, and then I have to talk about likability a little bit. It makes me laugh because I think I've told you this, Steve. In the last year and a half of my term as premier, every single scrum that I had with the media, I was asked repeatedly about my likability numbers. And I was asked in this way, what does it feel like to be the least liked premier in Canada? Like, great. It feels great.
Terrific, yeah.
I love it. Like, I never knew, what is it that you want me to say? And I
think I did that to you too, in this studio.
Yeah. The fact is that those 300 plus men were not asked that question over and over and over again. There were lots of men who've been reelected who nobody liked, apparently, but they felt that they were competent and smart and strong. And one of the things that was said to me by my team as we went through is, people know you're smart, they know you can make a decision, but they just don't like you. We got to figure that out. Well, what the hell? How do I do that? Anyway.
The Garment Workers Scheme, what was that?
This was originally through the Department of the Ministry of Labor, and it was based on the concept that Canada was short of skilled labor in various fields.
At the end of World War II.
At the end of World War II, it started in the logging industry, and the Jewish community picked up that idea and thought one way to bring Jews to Canada would be by having a Tailor Project.
So these
a
were
garment scheme.
These were Jewish refugees who had survived the
Hopefully,
Holocaust.
this would be Jewish refugees still in the DP camps, the displaced persons camps in Europe.
And your dad was one of them?
He was one of the 5 that went over. It was a team of 5 made up of both manufacturers and the labor. And it was a very solid team, very, very much involved in the project because they had arranged to commit many manufacturers to take on these new tailors and give them jobs.
2,500?
Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg, yes.
2,500 tailors.
2,500 tailors.
So if you do the math and consider their families and their progeny, we're talking about many, many, many thousands of people.
That's right.
How did you learn about this story?
Larry's apartment, actually. He told me this story. I've known Larry for a very long time. And in the fall of 2017, Larry had reconnected, I think, with this story through a remarkable woman, a writer named Anne Dublin, whose father had been part of the Tailor Project originally. And Larry told me about this project. Of course, I'd never heard about it, neither had many other people. And he said, I wonder if we could find out who the tailors are, where they are today. And the first thing that Larry's initial idea, still is core to what our approach is understanding not just their experience in Europe and the Holocaust, but in a longitudinal sense, what happened after they came to Canada, what happened to their families. And one of the first things he said is if we could find them, perhaps we could write a book about their experiences.
And it's turned into much more than that.
Yes, it has.
It's turned into a whole thing.
It has.
A light went on over your head, I guess, and in you dove.
Oh, yeah, and we dove. Well, we didn't actually know, I would say at the very beginning, it was possible that we might not have found who these people are, their names. It was 70 years ago. But the real key to it happened. Larry and I in January of 2018, I believe, Larry and I went to Montreal. We went to visit the Canadian Jewish Archives and the Montreal Holocaust Museum. And in the basement of the Canadian Jewish Archives, they started to pull out these boxes with original file folders for every ship that came to Canada in that time. And in those folders were all the manifests from the ships, lists of the people who came, the tailors, their religion, where they were from in Europe, where they were going where they were going in Canada.
So this Tailor Project is now a thing, and of the original 2,500 tailors that were brought over after World War II, some of them are still alive, I presume.
Yes, well, we have been in touch with, I think, about 6 of the tailors who are still alive. And then we have also heard from about 110, I believe, other families of tailors and are documenting their stories now.
And that's your mission now, is to document these stories.
It is, and we're moving as quickly as we can. And the book that we are writing based on their experiences and stories we published in 2020.
Gotcha. JVS, how did you guys get involved in this?
Well, we got involved because Max Ankin was actually his dad was our founding chairperson, and so he actually established JVS in 1947.
Which stands for, I think, Jewish
Vocational Services of Metropolitan Toronto is our official name, and we were started to serve Holocaust survivors and refugees after World War II who were coming to Canada, help find jobs.
So would you have been, I mean, maybe it's unknowable, but would you have been involved in trying to find work for the original tailors who came over at the end of the war?
It appears that some of them, it's been hard for us to get all that data. We were looking, but there's certainly a link between JVS and the Tailor Project coming over, no doubt. And what's interesting is to see kind of how that developed over time.
You did mention that you did have some World War II/Holocaust education when you went to school as a younger person. As you look back at it now, though, what do you think you didn't learn?
Well, there are many things we didn't learn. We didn't learn about Jewish contemporary culture. So being Jewish, or even the word Jew, the German word for Jew, we felt like we could only utter it with a whisper because we had no other association with it other than the Holocaust, even though some of my school friends were actually Jewish, but I didn't realize that until much later. Also, we didn't learn much about, we didn't learn to love our country. We didn't, of course, we learned about German writers and poets and philosophers and composers, but we didn't really learn, we didn't have any national pride or cultural pride about the achievements that had existed long before the Nazis came along. So we never sang old folk songs, for instance, which I think is problematic if you grow up in a country where there's a certain uprootedness, cultural uprootedness, and folk songs, for instance, they teach you so much about not only German culture, but what it means to be human. And if you don't grow up with that, I think it's really problematic.
Was it ever a subject of discussion at your home, asking your parents what your family ancestors had done during the war?
Yeah, I think that's a very common discussion in my generation. I think probably most Germans ask their parents that when they're teenagers. And but the problem is that their parents, so my grandparents, didn't talk about these things for the most part.
And your parents didn't experience it, obviously. They were too young.
Yeah, they were both born in 1946. And when they asked their parents, they just said very general things, like they didn't know what Hitler really, that he killed all these people. And they also didn't have the same technological tools that I have available now, the internet, but also that there were certain documents that weren't available then that are available now. So they didn't have the same context to do research.
Now, I don't ask this question with any judgment, so understand that off the top. But it is a well-worn expression that, we didn't know what was going on in our midst. So when you heard that that was the case for your own grandparents, did you believe it?
I don't know if I believed it. The narrative about my maternal grandfather, for instance, was that he was a driving teacher, and so he was needed in the war to teach German soldiers how to drive, and that's why he was never sent to the front line. So that was kind of a relief for me as a child, that narrative that he hadn't killed anybody, allegedly, and I don't have any proof even now that he ever did. But I believed, I took that story at face value, and I think that's what most of us, not only Germans, but tend to do. We believe the stories that we are told in our families about each other, and narrative is such a powerful thing. And I think it's rare that we actually then go back and think about whether what was said was really true. There were several rumors that circulated in the wider family. Another one was that my maternal grandfather himself was actually Jewish, but nobody, or of Jewish descent, but nobody had ever done any research into that, or that he had hidden his former Jewish employer in a garden shed under the Nazi regime, a garden shed that was later bombed by the Allies. And it's difficult to find proof for these things, but I try to deconstruct.
How serious a threat is white supremacy in Canada to our democracy, in your view?
Well, I think it's a very serious threat. When we did the first study, which we published in 2015, and we talked about here a few years ago, we identified about 100 active groups. And now we're starting to estimate, as we're ramping up on our second project, over 200, closer to 300 active groups. And these are people that are active online and offline. And in terms of threats to our democracy, in terms of the divisiveness, in terms of instilling a sense of not belonging amongst immigrants and people of color, visible minorities, I think that's a real dramatic threat to that sense of unity that has characterized us. And I think in terms of the election coming up, I think it is going to play an important role there in terms of the rhetoric and the narratives and how that's going to inflame, more hostility, perhaps.
There always has to be a Donald Trump question as it relates to this, so here it comes. Is Trump the cause of this, or is he a reflection of it?
Yeah, he's, I think, a reflection of it, or a part of it, or perhaps, fuel that added to the fire that was already here in Canada. I mean, prior to Trump's election, we were already seeing signs of this turn to the right, populist right, with Harper in the last administration and during the last election campaign. Kelly Leach as well, with her call for screening for Canadian values in Quebec under the Charter of Values, all of those sorts of pieces. So we were already seeing some of that, and Trump, I think, just added some legitimacy or credibility to those sorts of narratives here as well. Because the borders, I mean, the borders of social media and media are porous. So we were getting the same sound bites as Americans, and so not really distinguishing between, threats to America and threats to Canada.
So in our last minute here, as media consider how they intend to cover the upcoming Canadian election over the next 5 months, what would you like to see?
Yeah, well, I'd like to see more of the same. That is, over the last couple of years, I think the media have really been paying attention. I say, it's not a good sign when my phone's ringing off the hook, because there has been a lot of media attention on the far right, and I think there needs to continue to be. And I think that the media need to continue to shine light, not to let this go under the radar, not to let it go unremarked, but also then, I think breaking down some of those stereotypes that inform the public opinion polls that we looked at, breaking down some of those, not just the misinformation, but the explicit disinformation around contemporary patterns of demographics.
Would you give a so-called white nationalist candidate a place at a leaders' debate?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Because Faith Goldie was explicitly not invited to participate in so many of the Toronto mayoral debates.
Yeah. Well, if they're a viable candidate, I think they have a place at the table, and so that they can be countered. But as you suggested, are they really viable candidates at any level? I think Bernier is the question mark there. Will he be invited to those debates? And I suspect he will be.
Now, he would. Well, number one, he has a seat in Parliament. Number two, he would say he's not a white nationalist candidate. Yeah. So he belongs there. That's what he would say.
Yes. And he can make a choice, I think, is maybe stop appearing on rebel media, or acknowledge that he is at least sympathetic to the right.
Duly noted. And that is the Agenda's Week in Review for this Friday, May 24th, 2019. All of those conversations are available on our website. That's tvo.org. On our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, and on our Twitter feed. That's twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.